The grand chamber of Ethira Prime was older than most civilizations that sat within it, and on this particular morning, it hummed with the voices of 4,000 species who believed they controlled the stars. Ambassador Idara Osai stood near the back of the human delegation platform, her hands folded behind her back, her dark eyes watching the enormous hall with the patience of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. She had rehearsed nothing because there was nothing to rehearse. The decision had been made long before today. Above her, the vaulted ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed near the top, a deliberate architectural choice meant to remind every delegate how small they were compared to the institution they served. The Rithkari had built this chamber 6,000 years ago, and they had never let anyone forget it. High Arbiter sat upon the central dais, his insectoid frame towering over the delegates around him, his 4 arms folded across his thorax in the posture his species used to communicate supreme authority. He was discussing tariffs again, specifically the rates applied to hyperspace corridor usage in Sector 9 through Sector 14, all of which ran through or near human-occupied space. The rates had been increased for the 11th time in 40 years, and once again, the human delegation had not been consulted. Councillor Dreth Morvon of the Chelwary Trade Federation sat 3 rows below the Arbiter's dais, and he was the only one in the chamber who noticed Ambassador Os whispering something to her aide before standing. He watched her step forward to the speaking platform with a calm that made his stomach tighten, though he could not have explained why. The chair recognizes the representative of the United Human Confederacy, Velshon said without looking at her, his mandibles clicking in the pattern that indicated mild irritation at the interruption. Osai stepped into the light. She was not tall by human standards, and by the standards of most council species she was remarkably small, a creature of soft skin and blunt teeth and no claws and no venom and no natural armor. The Rithkari could crush stone with their hands, and the Falkir could survive in vacuum for short periods, and the Chelwary could regenerate entire limbs. But humans could do none of these things. They were, by every biological measure, one of the least impressive species ever to achieve spaceflight. And yet something in the way Idara Osai looked at the chamber made Councillor Morvon feel as if the temperature had just dropped several degrees. "Thank you, High Arbiter," she said, and her voice carried without effort across the vast space, not because of any amplification system, but because the entire chamber had fallen into an odd, anticipatory silence. "I will be brief." She placed her hands on the edges of the podium. 312 years ago, humanity was welcomed into this council as a probationary member, and we were told that in time we would earn our place among the stars. In those 312 years, we have built communication relays across 14 major hyperspace corridors at our own expense, staffed medical stations on frontier worlds where no other species would send their doctors, developed agricultural algorithms that feed 86 council-affiliated planets, and contributed to the defense of the Thornwall against the Vorcth Dominion with our ships and our blood. In return, we have been denied voting rights on 7 of the 12 primary committees, excluded from territorial expansion approvals, overcharged on corridor tariffs that we ourselves helped build, and referred to in the official council record as a probationary species. She paused. 312 years of probation is not probation. It is a message, and we have finally heard it. The silence in the chamber shifted, not to alarm, but to curiosity, the way a predator tilts its head at unexpected movement from something it considers prey. Effective immediately, the United Human Confederacy formally withdraws from the Galactic Council and all associated treaties, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, technology-sharing licenses, and infrastructure commitments. She reached into her coat and placed a small crystal on the podium. a data storage device containing the full legal record of the severance. Our borders will close within 72 standard hours, and all human personnel currently stationed on Council worlds will be recalled. We wish every species in this chamber peace, prosperity, and long life. This is not a negotiation, and there is nothing further to discuss. She stepped back from the podium. For a long moment nobody spoke, and then a sound rose from the upper galleries, laughter. It started with the Dranaki delegation, a species known for their booming voices and their deep contempt for what they called dramatic species, and it spread quickly. The Yolvari clicked their beaks in amusement, the Tosk gurgled their equivalent of a chuckle, and even several of the more dignified elder species allowed themselves expressions of condescension. Velshan raised one of his 4 hands to restore order, though even his compound eyes seemed to glitter with something close to amusement. "The Council thanks the human delegation for their candor," he said, and his mandibles formed the pattern that indicated a polite dismissal, "and regrets that the United Human Confederacy has chosen to take this step, though we trust that cooler heads will prevail in time. We wish humanity well in their future endeavors." The laughter continued in pockets around the chamber as Ambassador Osai turned and walked toward the exit. Her delegation of 14 humans fell in behind her, diplomats, aides, translators, and one military attaché who kept his eyes forward and his jaw locked. Not one of them looked back. Counselor Morvon watched them go, and the tightness in his stomach had become something worse, something that felt like the first tremor before a quake. He looked around the chamber at the laughing delegates and the dismissive arbiter and the already forgotten data crystal sitting on the podium, and he thought to himself that he had seen many dangerous things in his long career, but he had never seen anything quite as dangerous as a room full of powerful beings who did not understand what had just happened. Legate Tunos of the Falkir Military Command sat in the observer's gallery above the main floor, and he was not laughing. He had spent 40 years studying human military history, their wars, their strategies, their inexplicable willingness to endure suffering that would break any other species, and he understood something that the rest of the chamber did not. Humans did not make threats. When they told you what they were going to do, they had already done it. He watched the doors close behind the last member of the human delegation, and he pulled up his personal terminal and began composing a classified memo to Falkir High Command. The subject line read, "Immediate strategic reassessment required." Nobody in the chamber read it, because nobody in the chamber was paying attention to the Falkir Observer's gallery, and nobody in the chamber believed that anything important had just happened. The session moved on to the next agenda item within 4 minutes. 3 floors below the Grand Chamber, Ambassador Osai and her delegation stepped into a transport pod that would carry them to the docking ring where their ship waited. Her aide, a young man named Kofi, looked at her with wide eyes and asked the question that all of them were thinking. "Do you think they understood what just happened?" Osai watched the doors slide shut, and she allowed herself the smallest smile she had ever worn. "No," she said quietly. "Start the clock." And somewhere far away, in a secure facility buried beneath the frozen surface of Europa, Director Kalen Rourke received a 2-word transmission on a channel that had been waiting for this signal for 11 years. The message read, "Clock started." He closed his eyes, took one long breath, and opened a file labeled "The Quiet Exit." It was 4,000 pages long, and every single page had been written for this exact moment. 6 months after the humans left, the first relay went dark. It was Communication Relay 14, a station floating in the cold space between the Kelovan system and the Sharath expanse, and for over 200 years it had carried faster-than-light transmissions for nearly 60 species without a single day of interruption. Nobody had ever thought about who maintained it, because Nobody had ever needed to. The humans had built it. The humans had staffed it. And the humans had repaired it every time something went wrong. And they had done all of this for free as what they called a goodwill contribution to galactic connectivity. When it went dark, the Keluvan Trade Authority sent a repair crew, and the repair crew came back 3 days later with a report that made no sense to anyone who read it. The relay's core systems were built on a mathematical framework that no Keluvan engineer had ever seen before, a blend of chaos theory and recursive pattern generation that the humans apparently used as naturally as breathing. The crew could not even identify which components were broken, let alone fix them. Within 2 weeks, 4 more relays went dark across 3 sectors. Shipmaster Yevek of the Falkir Freight Service was the first captain to file a formal complaint with the Council's Trade Commission, though he would not be the last. He had been hauling cargo between the Chelwari homeworld and the outer colonies for 30 years, and in all that time, he had never once lost a transmission signal during a hyperspace transit. But now, his navigation updates were arriving late or not arriving at all, and twice in 1 week, he had dropped out of hyperspace at the wrong coordinates because the corridor beacons had not been updated. "Someone needs to explain to me," he said to the Trade Commission officer who took his complaint, "why the entire communication backbone of this sector apparently depended on one species that we treated like an afterthought." The officer did not have an answer. On the frontier world of Thesson IV, a colony of 12,000 Rithkari woke up one morning to find that the human medical station on the southern continent had been emptied overnight. Every piece of equipment removed, every supply crate taken, every human doctor and nurse gone. They had left behind a single notice posted on the door in clean, polite language, thanking the colony for their hospitality and wishing them good health. The colony's only surgeon, a Rithkari who had trained under the human doctors and who understood just enough of their medical techniques to know how much he did not understand, stood in the empty building and felt a fear he had never experienced before. The nearest non-human medical facility was 11 days away by standard transport. Thesson IV had 300 children under the age of 5. Across the Council's vast territory, similar scenes played out in dozens of locations. Human agricultural consultants withdrawing from farming worlds, human engineers departing from space stations they had helped design, human teachers leaving schools they had built in frontier communities. Each departure was polite, orderly, and accompanied by a formal notice expressing humanity's best wishes. Each one left a hole that nobody knew how to fill. In the halls of the Grand Chamber, Councillor Dreth Morvon stood before the assembled delegates and presented data that should have terrified every species in the room. "In the 6 months since humanity's withdrawal," he said, his Chelwari throat sacs vibrating with barely controlled urgency, "we have lost reliable communication in 14 hyperspace corridors, medical coverage in 31 frontier settlements, and agricultural output has declined by an average of 23% on 86 worlds that were using human-developed farming algorithms whose licenses have now expired." He paused to let the numbers sink in, but the faces staring back at him showed more irritation than alarm. "These are not isolated incidents. This is a pattern, and it is accelerating." High Arbiter leaned forward on the dais and spoke in the slow, deliberate cadence he used when addressing concerns he considered beneath him. "Councillor Morvon, the contributions of the human species, while noted, were never essential to the functioning of this council. We operated for thousands of years before they arrived, and we will continue to do so. The disruptions you describe are temporary inconveniences that will be resolved through the ingenuity of our member species." Morvon stared at the Arbiter, and for a moment he considered saying what he actually thought, which was that the Arbiter was a fool standing in a building whose foundations were crumbling while he admired the ceiling. but he held his tongue because he knew it would accomplish nothing. Instead, he returned to his seat and began composing a private message to every trade delegate he trusted. The message was simple: begin stockpiling essential supplies. This will get worse before it gets better. In the secure facility beneath Europa's ice, Director Kalen Rourke reviewed the daily reports from across Council space and allowed himself a grim satisfaction that he did not enjoy. Everything was proceeding exactly as modeled. 11 years ago, when he had first proposed the quiet exit to the UHC Parliament Security Committee, several members had accused him of paranoia. "You are suggesting," one senator had said, "that we spend a decade preparing to leave an institution we have spent 3 centuries trying to join. That is not strategy, that is madness." Rourke had stood at the podium and spoken without notes, because he had lived with these ideas for so long that they were part of him. "For 300 years we have given the Council our best technology, our best doctors, our best engineers, and our best soldiers, and in return they have patted us on the head and told us to wait our turn. They see us as useful but unimportant, as servants, not partners. What I am proposing is not madness, it is a mirror. We will show them exactly what they had by showing them what it looks like when it is gone." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Humanity would not sabotage anything, would not steal anything, would not threaten anyone. They would simply stop giving away what they had never been thanked for. The relays would go dark because no one else knew how to maintain them. The medical stations would close because no one else had volunteered to staff them. The agricultural algorithms would expire because they were licensed, not donated, and the licenses had always had an end date that nobody had bothered to read. Every single thing that was now failing had been designed to fail, not through sabotage, but through the simple, inevitable consequence of removing the people who made it work. And the Council could not even be angry about it, because humanity had broken no laws, violated no treaties, and damaged no property. They had simply gone home. Velshan, after weeks of growing pressure from nervous delegates, finally dispatched an envoy to the human border, a mid-ranking Tosk diplomat named Gurath, who was chosen specifically because sending a senior official would imply that the Council considered the situation serious, which Velshan refused to admit. Gurath traveled for 9 days to reach the border of human space, and when he arrived, he found something that unsettled him far more than he had expected. The border was not guarded by warships or military stations. Instead, a network of automated beacons floated in perfect formation across every entry point, each one broadcasting a message in 6,000 languages on a continuous loop. "Humanity wishes all nations peace and prosperity. Our borders are closed to Council-affiliated traffic. We hope this is temporary." Gurath transmitted his diplomatic credentials and requested entry. The response came back within seconds, polite, warm, and absolutely immovable. "The United Human Confederacy thanks the Galactic Council for its interest. At this time, we are not receiving diplomatic missions. We will reach out when we are ready to discuss further." Gurath tried 7 more times over 3 days, using every diplomatic protocol he knew, and each time the response was identical: kind, respectful, and utterly final. He returned to Ethira Prime and delivered his report to Velshan in private, and for the first time, the High Arbiter's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Gurath had never seen before, a pattern that in the Rithkari language had no direct translation, but that meant something close to the first cold breath of a fear that one has been trying very hard not to feel. "They would not even let you inside?" Velshan asked. "No, High Arbiter." "Did they seem angry?" Gurath hesitated, because the truth was stranger than anger. "No, they seemed patient." Velshan said nothing for a very long time. And across the border, behind the polite beacons and the closed doors, Humanity was not waiting. They were building. 18 months after the humans walked out of the Grand Chamber, the Vorcth came. The first attack hit a mining colony on the edge of the Thornwall, a border region that stretched across 40 light-years of contested space between the Council's territory and the Vorcth Dominion. For 2 centuries, the Thornwall had been patrolled by a combined fleet in which human warships made up only 15% of the total number, but carried out nearly 60% of all combat operations, because human captains had a way of fighting that no tactical computer could predict and no enemy could prepare for. Now the Thornwall was empty, and War Queen Cythara of the Vorcth Dominion had been watching the gap with her cold, calculating eyes for months. The mining colony of Dravith Station had a population of 8,000 mostly Tosk and Yulvari workers, who had come to extract rare minerals from the asteroid belt nearby. They had no warships, no military garrison, and no warning system, because the warning system had been a human-designed sensor network that went offline 4 months after the withdrawal. The Vorcth raiders dropped out of hyperspace at dawn, and within 6 hours the station was burning. 1,100 people died before a Council patrol fleet arrived, and the patrol fleet was so badly outmatched that it barely escaped with half its ships intact. The news reached Ethira Prime like a shockwave, and for the first time in living memory, the Grand Chamber fell into a silence that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with fear. High Arbiter stood on his dais and spoke to the assembled delegates, with a confidence that everyone in the room could tell was hollow. This is a tragedy, but it is not a crisis. The Vorcth have launched raids before and they have always been pushed back. Our combined fleets are more than capable of defending our borders. Legate Tunos of the Falkir Military Command requested permission to speak, and when he received it, he did not stand at the podium, but instead activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with a 3-dimensional map of the Thornwall. High Arbiter, with respect, I must present the strategic reality. He highlighted section after section of the border in red. In the 18 months since humanity's withdrawal, we have lost sensor coverage across 78% of the Thornwall. Our response time to incursions has increased from hours to days, and the Vorcth are not launching raids. He paused and looked directly at Velshan. They are testing our defenses, and they are finding nothing. The raids will become invasions within 6 months. This is not a prediction. It is a mathematical certainty based on Vorcth expansion patterns that human analysts identified decades ago, and that we apparently never bothered to study ourselves. The chamber erupted in arguments, delegates shouting over each other, accusations flying between species, old rivalries resurfacing under the pressure of genuine danger. And behind it all, a question that nobody wanted to ask out loud but that everyone was thinking: where are the humans and how do we get them back? Far from the Grand Chamber, on the other side of the closed border, Dr. Nneka Ademi sat in a monitoring station on Titan and watched the data feeds from Council space with a weight on her chest that grew heavier every day. She was a xenobiologist by training, but she had been reassigned to the Strategic Separation Observatory, a facility whose only job was to watch what happened in Council space after the withdrawal and to document everything. She watched the casualty reports from Dravith Station scroll across her screen, and she pressed her hands against her face and breathed slowly until the nausea passed. 1100, she said to no one. Director Kalen Rourke entered the monitoring room behind her, his footsteps quiet on the metal floor, and he looked at the same data she was looking at with an expression that was impossible to read. The Vorcth hit Dravith Station, Ademi said without turning around. I know. 1,100 dead, mostly miners and their families. I know. She turned to face him and her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. How many more are going to die? while we sit here behind our nice clean border and watch." Rurk pulled a chair beside her and sat down, and for a moment he was not the cold architect of the quiet exit, but simply a tired man who had not slept well in months. "Every death out there is a tragedy, and I will carry them for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand something, Nneka. Those deaths are not on our hands. They are on the hands of a council that took everything we gave them and laughed when we asked to be treated as equals. We did not create this crisis. We simply stopped preventing it." Adami shook her head slowly. "That is a very clean distinction, Director, and I am sure it looks wonderful in a policy document. But those miners did not vote to exclude us from the council. Those families did not laugh when Ambassador Osai walked out, and those children did not choose any of this." Rurk looked at her for a long time, and then he looked down at his hands, and she saw something she had never seen before. They were shaking. "I know," he said quietly, and this time the words carried a weight that told her he was not reciting policy, but confessing something he had been carrying alone for a very long time. Meanwhile, the Council's attempts to replace what humanity had left behind were failing on every front. A coalition of 12 species pooled their best engineers and spent 4 months trying to rebuild a single human communication relay. And at the end of 4 months, they had a device that worked at 11% of the original's capacity and burned out after 9 days. The problem was not intelligence. The Council species were brilliant in their own ways, many of them far older and more technologically advanced than humanity in specific domains. The problem was that human engineering did not work the way anyone else's engineering worked. Human systems were built on intuition as much as logic, on leaps of reasoning that skipped steps other species considered essential, on a tolerance for chaos and improvisation that was baked into every circuit and every line of code. A Rithkari engineer who studied the relay's design described it as a machine that should not work but does, built by a species that solves problems by making inspired guesses, and then refusing to fail. Legate Tunos, in his classified briefing to the Inner Council, the small group of senior delegates who handled matters too sensitive for the full chamber, finally said the thing that everyone needed to hear but nobody wanted to. Humans are not remarkable because they are strong, they are not, and by our standards they are fragile. They are not remarkable because they are intelligent. Many species in this council have greater raw cognitive capacity. They are remarkable because they adapt faster than any species in recorded galactic history. They iterate, they improvise, they integrate, and they do it at a speed that we cannot match. In 312 years, they made themselves essential to the functioning of this council, in ways that none of us noticed until they were gone. Not because they plan to hold us hostage, but because being useful is simply what they do. And now they have been behind closed borders for 18 months, and if they have been applying that same speed of adaptation to their own development, without the restrictions we placed on them. He stopped, and the Inner Council saw something they had never seen on a Falkir face, genuine apprehension. Then the species that comes back to this table, if they come back at all, will not be the species that left. Velshan authorized a full diplomatic mission, not a minor envoy this time, but a delegation of senior representatives from 8 species, carrying formal apologies and offers of revised membership terms. They traveled to the human border and were met by a single ship. Ambassador Idara Osai stood on the bridge of that ship and received the delegation's credentials through a communication channel, and she read their offers carefully, and she was quiet for exactly 30 seconds before she responded. "I will relay the Council's concerns to the Parliament of the United Human Confederacy. We will respond in our own time. Thank you for coming." The delegation's lead negotiator, a veteran Chelwari diplomat who had brokered peace between warring empires, asked when they could expect a response. Osai looked at him through the viewscreen with eyes that were neither angry nor cold, but simply patient in a way that made every diplomat in the room feel as though they were speaking to someone who could see much further ahead than they could. "When we are ready," she said. And then the escort ships guided the delegation back across the border, and the beacons resumed their endless, polite broadcast, and the diplomats returned to Ethira Prime with nothing. Nothing except the growing, unavoidable understanding that humanity was not punishing the Council. They were simply waiting for the Council to understand what it had lost. 3 years after humanity closed its borders, the galaxy was breaking apart. The Vorcth Dominion had launched a full-scale invasion across the Thornwall, and their fleets poured through the undefended border like floodwater through a shattered dam. 3 Council sectors fell in the first month, not because the Council lacked ships or weapons, but because they lacked something far more important. They lacked the ability to fight the way humans fought. The Vorcth were a brute force species, massive and relentless, and their strategy was simple: overwhelm the enemy with numbers and crush anything that resisted. For 2 centuries, this approach had failed against the Thornwall patrols, because human commanders did not fight with numbers. They fought with creativity. They laid traps in asteroid fields. They used civilian freight signals to mask the approach of attack squadrons. They retreated when the enemy expected them to charge and charged when the enemy expected them to retreat. And they communicated with each other through a rapid, intuitive shorthand that no tactical computer had ever been able to decode, because it was not a code at all. It was simply the way humans thought when they were under pressure. The Council fleets had none of this. They fought by doctrine, by the carefully preserved manuals of species that had been waging war the same way for thousands of years. And against the Vorcth's relentless waves, these doctrines crumbled like sand. The combined fleet of the Council suffered 3 devastating defeats in 6 weeks, losing hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of lives. And after the 3rd defeat, the coalition began to fracture. 12 species formally withdrew from the Council's mutual defense pact within a single week, declaring that they would form their own regional alliances rather than trust their survival to an institution that had proven incapable of protecting them. High Arbiter stood in a grand chamber that was now half empty and delivered speeches about unity and resilience that rang hollow against the backdrop of burning colonies and fleeing refugees. He had aged visibly. His once proud posture had begun to curve inward. His mandibles clicked in patterns that his aides had never seen before, and the authority in his voice had been replaced by something that sounded very much like desperation. The Council that had endured for 6,000 years was dying, and everyone knew it. It was in this moment that Councillor Dreth Morvon did something that would change everything. He resigned his position, surrendered his diplomatic credentials, and traveled to the human border not as a representative of the Council but as a private citizen. A single Chelwary with no authority and no leverage, carrying nothing but honesty. The border beacons scanned his ship and broadcast their usual message, and Morvon responded with a transmission of his own. "My name is Dreth Morvon. I am not here on behalf of the Council because the Council has nothing left to offer. I am here because billions of lives are at stake, and I believe that the humans are the only ones who can help. I am asking not as a diplomat but as a person." He waited in silence for 6 hours. Then his communication panel lit up with a docking frequency and a set of coordinates, and a voice he did not recognize said simply, "Follow the signal. Welcome to human space, Counselor." What Morvon saw behind the border changed his understanding of what humanity was. He had expected to find a species licking its wounds, isolated, diminished, perhaps even struggling without the Council's vast resources. Instead, he found a civilization that had been utterly transformed. The human shipyards above Mars were producing vessels unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, angular craft that seemed to bend light around their hulls, powered by drives that his ship's sensors could not even classify. On Earth, cities had been redesigned around new energy systems that drew power from sources Morvon's scientific training told him should not be possible. Medical facilities were treating diseases that the Council considered incurable, using techniques that appeared to rewrite cellular structure at a level so fundamental that Morvon's translator struggled to find equivalent terms in his language. 312 years of suppressed potential, 3 centuries during which humanity had given its best ideas to a council that restricted their development and controlled their expansion, had been unleashed in just 3 years, and the results were staggering. Morvon walked through the streets of a city called Nairobi and watched human children playing in parks beneath towers that touched the clouds, and he understood with a clarity that hurt like a physical blow that the Council had not merely underestimated humanity. They had actively held them back, and humanity had let them because they had believed foolishly, patiently, with the stubborn optimism that defined their species, that if they proved their worth, they would eventually be accepted. That belief had died in the Grand Chamber 3 years ago, killed by laughter. Morvon was granted an audience with the UHC Parliament, and he stood before the elected representatives of humanity and did something that no council species had ever done. He told the truth. "You were right to leave," he said, and his throat sacs trembled with the effort of saying words that went against every instinct his species had, the instinct to negotiate, to maneuver, to never admit weakness. "We were wrong, not in small ways or in ambiguous ways, but in fundamental, shameful ways. We took what you offered and we treated you as lesser beings, and when you told us you were leaving, we laughed at you. I cannot undo that, no one can. But I am here because the Vorcth are burning their way through council space, and they are killing millions of people who never wronged humanity. Farmers and teachers and children who have no idea why the ships that used to protect them are gone. And if the Vorcth are not stopped, they will eventually reach your borders too, because empires built on conquest do not stop conquering." The Parliament listened, and when Morvon finished speaking there was a silence that he recognized. It was the same silence that had filled the Grand Chamber when Osai delivered her withdrawal speech, the silence of a room where something irreversible was being decided. But the decision was not simple, and Morvon could see it in the faces around him. A representative from the South American Federation stood and spoke with a voice that carried the anger of millions. "They laughed at us, they laughed, Counselor, and now their worlds burn and they come to us for help, and we are supposed to forget the laughter and bleed for them again." A delegate from the Pan-African Union responded quietly but firmly. "If we watch innocent people die because the people who wronged us failed to protect them, then we are not the species I believed we were. We become exactly what the Council always treated us as: small." The debate raged for 3 days in the Parliament, in the media, in homes and schools, and gathering places across every human world. The isolationists argued that humanity owed the Council nothing, and that helping would only invite future exploitation. The interventionists argued that humanity's worth was not proven by walking away, but by choosing to return when it mattered most. The pragmatists argued that the Vorcth would not stop at council borders, and that engaging now from a position of strength was better than waiting to fight alone later. Ambassador Idara Osai, who had not spoken publicly since the day she walked out of the Grand Chamber, requested the floor on the final day of debate. She stood at the same podium where she had once briefed Parliament on council politics, and she looked older than Morvon remembered, not tired but weathered, like a stone that had been shaped by years of wind. 3 years ago I stood before this body and recommended that we leave the Galactic Council, and I stand by that decision. We left to prove a point, and the point has been proven. The galaxy knows what we are worth now, because the galaxy has felt what it means to be without us. But proof was never the purpose. The purpose was to be seen, to be treated as equals, to have a seat at the table where our voice carries the same weight as any other. If we stay behind our borders and watch the fire, we will be safe, but we will have become the very thing we accuse the Council of being, a power that protects only itself. The question before us is not whether we owe them our help. We do not. The question is who we choose to be. She paused and looked across the chamber at the faces of humanity's representatives. I say we walk into the fire, not because they deserve it, but because we do. The vote was held that evening. It passed by 17 votes, the narrowest margin in UHC parliamentary history. Humanity would return to the galactic stage, but not as a junior member crawling back to a broken institution. They would return as equals, as architects of whatever came next, and on terms that would never again allow any species to mistake their kindness for weakness. Morvon received the news in his guest quarters, and he sat down heavily and covered his face with his hands and wept, not from relief alone, but from the overwhelming understanding that humanity had just done the most human thing imaginable. They had chosen to save the people who had wronged them, not because they had forgotten the wrong, but because they refused to let the wrong define them. And somewhere on Europa, Director Kalen Rourke read the vote results and closed the file labeled "The Quiet Exit" for the last time. He opened a new file. It was labeled "The Return." And his hands, for the first time in 3 years, were steady. The human fleet crossed the border at dawn on a Tuesday, and the galaxy held its breath. There were 847 ships in the formation, which was not a large number by Council standards. The combined fleets of the remaining Council species numbered in the tens of thousands. But the moment those 847 ships appeared on the long-range sensors of every species within scanning distance, something extraordinary happened. Every sensor operator in 3 sectors said the same thing at almost the same time. What are those? The ships that emerged from human space were nothing like the vessels that had left 3 years ago. They were longer, sharper, and they moved through space with a fluidity that suggested they were not merely traveling through the void but reshaping it as they went. Their hulls were coated in a material that absorbed sensor signals instead of reflecting them, which meant that the only reason anyone could detect them at all was because the humans wanted to be seen. Their weapons systems registered as blank spaces on every scanner, not invisible but unreadable, as if the technology behind them operated on principles that the scanning equipment had not been designed to measure. And at the heart of the formation flew the flagship of the United Human Confederacy, a vessel called the OSI, named after the woman who had walked out of the Grand Chamber and set the clock ticking on the most dramatic transformation in galactic history. Ambassador Idara OSI herself stood on the bridge of her namesake ship, dressed not in diplomatic robes, but in the simple dark uniform of the UHC Naval Command, and she looked out at the stars with the expression of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. All ships, this is Ambassador OSI. We are crossing the Thornwall in 6 hours. Our mission is to engage and repel the Vorcth invasion fleet, protect civilian populations, and establish a secure corridor for evacuation and relief operations. She paused. 3 years ago we left this part of space because we were told we did not matter. Today we return because we know that we do fight well, fight smart, and bring everyone home. The fleet acknowledged in unison, and 847 ships surged forward into the burning remains of what had once been the Council's proudest border. The Vorcth had been expecting resistance. War Queen Sithara was not a fool, and her intelligence networks had detected the human fleet's departure from their home space. But she was not worried. She had studied the humans as they were 3 years ago. Clever, adaptable, but limited by Council-era technology and small fleet numbers. She had prepared for that version of humanity. She had not prepared for what actually arrived. The first engagement happened in the debris field of a destroyed Council outpost, and it lasted 11 minutes. The Vorcth Vanguard, 200 heavy warships crewed by the most experienced warriors in the Dominion, moved to intercept the human formation in a standard crushing pattern, the same tactic that had shattered Council fleets 3 times in the past month. The human fleet did not engage the pattern. Instead, 40 ships broke from the main formation and accelerated to speeds that the Vorcth sensors could not track, disappearing behind the debris field. And while the Vorcth commander was trying to locate them, the remaining human ships fired weapons that no one in the galaxy had ever seen before. The beams did not destroy the Vorcth ships. They disabled them, cutting through shields and armor with surgical precision to sever power conduits and weapon systems without breaching the hulls. In 11 minutes, 200 Vorcth warships were drifting dead in space, their crews alive but helpless, and not a single human ship had taken damage. The 40 ships that had disappeared behind the debris field reappeared behind the Vorcth second line and repeated the performance. Legate Tunos commanded a Falkier support fleet that had been assigned to coordinate with the human forces, and he watched the battle from his flagship's observation deck, with an expression that his second officer would later describe as a man watching something impossible happen, and realizing that he had always known it would. "I spent 40 years studying their wars," Tunos said quietly, "and I thought I understood them." He watched another Vorcth formation collapse under an attack pattern that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Chaotic, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. I understood nothing. The Battle of the Thornwall lasted 3 days, and it was not a single engagement but a rolling series of confrontations across the entire length of the border, as the human fleet drove the Vorcth back sector by sector. The humans fought the way they had always fought, with creativity, with adaptability, with an instinct for finding weakness that bordered on the supernatural. But now they had 3 years of unrestricted technological development behind them, and the combination was something the galaxy had never witnessed. They used gravity manipulation to redirect Vorcth torpedoes back at the ships that fired them. They deployed autonomous drone swarms that communicated through quantum-entangled networks and reacted faster than any living pilot could. They projected false fleet signatures that tricked Vorcth commanders into attacking empty space, while the real ship struck from angles that should not have been possible. And through it all, they killed as few Vorcth as they could. This was the part that confused everyone: the Falkier, the Chelwari, the remaining Council species who were monitoring the battle from a safe distance. The humans had the firepower to annihilate the Vorcth fleet down to the last ship, and everyone knew it. The Vorcth knew it too, which was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. But instead of destroying, they disabled; instead of killing, they captured. And when a Vorcth crew surrendered, the humans accepted the surrender and provided medical aid to the wounded. War Queen Sithara made her final stand at the edge of the Thornwall with her personal fleet of 300 ships, and when the human formation surrounded her flagship, she did not surrender because surrender was not something Vorcth queens did. Ambassador Osai contacted her directly on an open channel, and the two leaders faced each other through viewscreens. The towering, armored War Queen with her scarred face and her burning eyes, and the small, quiet human woman who had changed the shape of the galaxy by walking out of a room. "War Queen Sithara, your fleet is disabled and your invasion has failed. I am offering you terms: full withdrawal from Council space, disarmament of your offensive fleet, and supervised integration into the new galactic framework that will replace the Council. If you accept, your people will be treated with dignity, and your species will have a voice in the future of this galaxy. If you refuse, I will destroy your fleet down to the last ship, and your dominion will end today." Sithara stared at her for a long time, and what she saw was not the soft, clawless creature that the council had dismissed for 3 centuries. She saw steel. "You would really destroy us?" the War Queen asked. "I would rather not," Os replied, "but I will not allow you to threaten innocent lives. And I need you to understand that this is not a negotiation. It is a choice, and you have 60 seconds to make it." Cythara was a conqueror and a warrior, and she respected nothing in the universe except strength. But she also recognized something in the human woman's eyes that went beyond strength, something she had no word for in her own language. It was the willingness to show mercy combined with the absolute readiness to destroy if mercy was rejected, and it was more frightening than any weapon. "I accept your terms," the War Queen said. The battle was over. In the weeks that followed, the old Galactic Council was formally dissolved in the same grand chamber where Ambassador Os had delivered her withdrawal speech 3 years earlier. In its place, humanity helped draft the Compact of Ethira, a new framework built on genuine equal representation, transparent governance, mutual accountability, and a founding principle that no species would ever again be treated as probationary. Every species would have a voice from the day they joined, and every contribution would be acknowledged and valued. Velshan, who had aged more in 3 years than in the previous 50, approached Ambassador Os as the final documents were being signed. He was diminished, his posture bent, his authority gone, his legacy reduced to the ashes of an institution he had failed to protect, and he looked at the small human woman with compound eyes that held something they had never held before. "Humility. Why did you come back?" he asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "After everything we did, the dismissals, the laughter, the centuries of disrespect, why did you come back?" Osai looked at him, and she did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she did not lecture, because none of those things would have been worthy of the moment. "Because leaving was never the point," she said. "Being seen was." Velshan lowered his great head, and his mandibles clicked once in a pattern that meant something very old and very simple in the Rithkari language. It meant, "I understand now, and I am sorry." Across the chamber, Councillor Morvon, now Representative Morvon of the new compact, sat at his desk and opened his private journal, something he had kept since the day he first entered politics 60 years ago. He thought for a long time about what to write, and then he began. "The humans have a saying, 'You do not know what you have until it is gone.' I would change it slightly. You do not know who you have until they stop carrying you." He closed the journal and looked up at the grand chamber, which was filled now with delegates from hundreds of species, all talking and arguing and debating the way free peoples do when they are building something new. And at the center of it all, human representatives moved among their colleagues, not above them, not below them, but beside them, exactly where they had always wanted to be. On a frontier world at the edge of what had once been the Thornwall, a young human girl stood in a field of alien grass and looked up at a sky filled with ships from 100 different species, all flying together under the banner of the new compact. She waved at the sky the way children do, when they believe that someone up there might wave back. Beside her, a young Rithkari child, the daughter of an engineer who had helped rebuild the communication relays alongside human technicians, looked up at the same sky and raised one of her 4 small hands. They waved together at the ships above them, and neither of them knew or cared about the 3 years of silence and suffering that had brought the galaxy to this moment. They only knew that the sky was full of lights, and that the lights were beautiful, and that somehow, against all odds and despite everything, the future looked like it might be kind.